It slid to the edge of the road and dropped over the steep edge soundlessly. The long sliding tracks the car had left in the snow lazed backwards in a serpentine line until they went to the very edge of that roadway. Once over the edge, however, the car fell in mid-air. It started a series of tumbles that made an awful series of crunches, scrapes, and breaking glass thumps. Kayana should have heard these things, but she didn't, and she never would. Her car was gone as silently as if it had never moved an inch. If a car crashes and no one hears it, it doesn't make any sound at all. Kayana would not have believed that her car could have been destroyed that easily and that silently, but it was. The snow that she had spun up with her rear tire had frozen against the tread, and the sheer weight of her car, vibrating against the hole she had dug, finally just forced the tire through the patch of ice, and the car was free. It had started sliding very slowly at first, slowly enough in fact that Kayana didn't see the gentle seesawing of her headlights in back of her. As it built up speed, it finally turned sideways, and that was when the lights had gone out over the hill. It had continued on sideways until it went over the edge of the road, and the headlamps, making one last upturned plea to heaven, came to an end. Once over the edge, the car had tumbled 5 times, neatly wadding the body into a brownish knot of metal, smashing out the windows and popping open the doors like broken jacks in the box. The hood peeled off on the 3rd flip, and the trunk waited until just before the boulder-lined creek to fly off in a rage of snapping springs. The windshield had struck a large boulder, being the first part of the car to touch water, and exploded like a bomb going off. Kayana heard nothing at all. It had to be a house, she had been thinking when her car had destroyed itself. This building ahead, it must be a house. As Kayana walked along, things occurred to her as she neared the lights, still way off in the distance. The lights were square now, and so she knew that they had to represent windows. She stared at them, hypnotized by their incandescence, and her thoughts regurgitated back into her mind the things she now knew about her mother. Had her mother moved away from her because Kayana was now too big to get her tail whipped? Had her mother left because she felt like she had lost control over her overly large daughter? Kayana felt the coldness of that thought and tasted its truth for the very first time. It was true, wasn't it? Kelly still could have done it, argued Kayana with herself. Kayana would have knelt over and allowed it. She was, or had been, after all, only 6 years old in maturity. Sure, Kayana would have submitted to the punitive will of her mother. Her mom had often joked that Kayana would never get too old to get a beating if she needed one, and Kayana had believed that. But think, Kayana, she asked herself, think back to just before Kelly met Don Blue. Weren't there a couple of arguments between you guys that did not end in a smack across the mouth or a beating? Didn't these arguments end with Kelly just hanging her head and saying nothing more? Yeah, but I was right on those. Or, yeah, but they weren't real arguments at all. We didn't mean anything. Yeah, but... Kayana swallowed bitterly. It was true, wasn't it? Kelly was a smaller and more delicate woman than her daughter, and maybe she did want to be free of that awesome parental responsibility, especially if her daughter was as big as the side of a house. Maybe in a way Kelly feared to have to exercise control over Kayana any longer. Their relationship, as loving as it had been based on the fact that Mom was the final authority and Baby was the submissive. That had changed with Kayana graduating high school. It had changed with something, for damn sure. "I'm sorry, Mama," she said to herself, feeling cold and guilty. "I'm sorry I couldn't stay a baby for you, for God knows I wanted to. God knows I tried to stay that way for you. I'm sorry. I won't stay long if I ever do get to see you again. I will visit and leave you, I swear it. I'll make myself leave you. I know you are afraid of me now as a woman, and I won't have you frightened of me for any reason." Growing up was certainly a lot of pain, she decided. She was now approaching the house, and she did so with trepidation. Yet she felt brave all the same. She knew a lot would have to happen between here and there to get her to change her mind about going inside. She was more afraid of this cold out here than she was of anyone in that house. Kayana had the feeling that, if she approached the windows and put her cold nose to the glass, even if she saw 3 men in their underwear sitting around a fire, field dressing a deer right on a bearskin rug, she'd still knock and ask to be let in. Cold was worse, she decided. She might change her mind later, once she had been taken inside, but for now the cold had decided for her. Kayana's nose was beginning to run, and her throat was getting raw. Her feet were frozen solid, and her sneakers had been soaked clean through with freezing moisture. She couldn't feel any worse than she did right now, no matter what they did to her. And if they did anything to her at all, at least she would be warm. Warmth was her main goal right now, her prime directive. She walked up on the porch and over to the door. She didn't stop to look in the windows. She didn't stop to check the rooms, though the 2 very large bay windows presented themselves to her near the swing and over by the steps. She walked right up and lifted her hand to knock on the great wooden door, as certain of herself as if she had been a burly large police officer serving a warrant. Fear was lying torpid within her and unable to warn her of the dangers she would have otherwise feared. Now she feared nothing except that she would have to break a window to get inside, to get warm. And this she would do if she had to. She had hardly noticed that, in the darkness, all of the windows had been unusually lit. She had failed to notice thick smoke, thick enough to choke a passing horse, was pouring out of the chimneys above her head. She had felt her eyes sting from the intense smoke, but since she couldn't see it, she did not consciously perceive it. There was a heat coming from this house, a heat that drew her uncontrollably towards it. Kayana was like a stray animal seeking shelter. Pride, safety, and priorities were no longer factors in her behavior. Deep in her throat she gave a cute, primeval grunt that signified her delight at finding the house. Her pleasure at being safe registered sexually within her, and she felt tingly inside. She would be warm in just a moment, as soon as she got inside this place. She had the presence of mind to try and knock first, before she twisted the brass knob and rattled the occupants with her rudeness. She placed her hand on the freezing cold knob, and she raised her other hand to knock. She would wait a few seconds, and then she would turn the knob. If that didn't work, she would beat on the door with her fists frantically. Somewhere between that point and whatever else she could think of to do, her duffel bag was most certainly going to go crashing through that lovely window and let some of that wonderfully enticing heat out. She didn't know how long she would give the occupants to respond to her knock, but if she had to get in by means of breaking glass, she would do this. Kayana's pain threshold, shallow as it was, had reached critical mass. She had to get her buns by that fire, and right now. It was like having to pee really badly and not being able to find a place to do it. Kayana's urge for comfort was that urgent. Her need for heat was brutal within her unseasoned body. She knocked upon the door, and the door pushed open. She gasped and stepped back, even as the heat rushed out into her face. It wasn't just warm in that house. It was dangerously hot. "What in the hell's going on?" asked a voice in her mind. She cautiously stepped inside the house and stood there with her hand behind her back on the knob. She resembled, standing there, a naughty daughter who is home very late from a date and knows she is in Dutch with her folks. Her face was white with panic, and her nose was red with cold. Trickles of mucus dripped down to her lip and off her chin. In her state of alert, however, she noticed nothing but her surroundings. She sniffed and swallowed salty snot. Her exhale was open-mouthed. No one was here. She walked on into the house, leaving the door open. It was so hot in here that the house had to breathe. The closeness of the rural farmhouse had not been ventilated since the fires had been started. That musty corn bin smell was evident in these rooms. She walked on inside, dropping the heavy duffel bag to the floor gratefully. She was glad to smell the funk of anybody's house now. Although Kayana had a natural aversion to odor, even cooking odor, she smelled deeply the smell of salvation that these turn-of-the-century rooms provided her. It smelled of safeness, a rescued niceness. No one came to meet her. She looked about the room and saw that the front door led into a small stone foyer, which led directly up a long flight of close stairs. On either side of these stairs were several rooms. She had walked to her right upon leaving the main foyer, and was now standing near a stove that was blistering hot. It was a Fisher stove, it read, and it was hot as a bitch. The small wheels up front were in their fully open draft position, and she could see the flames inside just blazing away. She turned around, walked past her discarded duffel bag, and then back through the stone foyer into what appeared to be a dining room. This room had a great old oak table with 4 obligatory chairs, which somehow didn't look like they had been used in quite a while. Over by the wall stood 2 more of these old chairs, as silent sentinels for guests. Typical Homes and Gardens look, she decided. There was nothing on the table like silverware, nor even an arrangement of any kind. The table was bare, as though all the linens and things had been taken away for laundering. She made her way into the kitchen, conspicuous because it was an extension of the dining room. There was no wall to separate the 2 rooms at all. There was just a small serving bar between them to show the demarcation. A row of cabinets over a formica countertop also added to delineate between the rooms, so she reasoned that the builders of this place figured that was enough. She walked into the kitchen on the floor of linoleum which resembled prearranged stones in its pattern. It was such a lovely pattern that for a moment she had hopes that someone female might still be living here. Females would be more open, more understanding of her peril than men. A female living out here would have to empathize with the lost little city slicker blonde. A female out here would have to often wonder about getting the hell out herself. Kayana thought of Kelly out here in one of these God-forsaken houses, and she sighed deeply in her soul. Women were made for civilization. Civilization and cities. That was when she saw the knife. She saw this wicked-looking knife on the countertop. It was stuck into a big piece of wood that someone was using for a cutting board. It looked ominous as she walked closer to it. All of her thoughts of a woman living here faded away as she stared at this knife. It scared her to look at it. She reasoned and tried to tell herself that it didn't belong to Jason or Freddy Krueger. It was just a knife. A sabatier. Mrs. Cherbourg had one. A knife like this one was, well, commonplace. If only it wasn't jammed down into the block of wood like it belonged in the Museum of Unnatural History. If only it was a sheath knife, sheathed in a nice contemporary wood-colored block with about 15 other nicer, smaller, sane-sized steak knives. If only. But it stood alone like a menacing silver decision. She made the decision and tried not to think about how hard it was to uproot the knife from the board. A couple of good yanks, in fact, before she finally unseated it from the block of wood. She could see where it had been driven into the wood, a distance of at least a half an inch. Damn! Who had shoved it in there so tightly? King Arthur? Whoever had done it, he was male. Had to be a man. She hefted the knife, feeling its power and its weight, and she pointed the blade away from herself. Cutting surface to the bottom. She held it tightly out in front of her. If she held the knife in both hands, she could be sure of some protection with this thing. She decided to carry it with her now, just like she was holding it, poked out in front of her. If she met anyone she could explain, the knife would give her time to explain. The sight of this blade would give her a chance. If anyone would listen to her, and not be too surprised that she was armed with their cutlery. She walked back into the darkened back room and saw that the rooms were all designed, downstairs, to wrap around that main staircase she had seen upon entering the foyer. If her theory held out, she could continue on around and be back in the living room, where the blistering hot Fisher stove was. She walked around through the rooms and grew colder. There weren't any fire back here, burning up a storm, but that front room was hot enough to melt a plastic cup. Kayana had never felt a fire that hot in her life. She switched on some lights and toured quickly, wanting to ascertain that she was alone in here. She shivered now that she was out of the heat again, and she put up her hands, wrapped around the knife, to wipe her running nose on the back of her left hand. She brought the blade up close to her face, but looked beyond it as she walked along. Finally she was in the living room again, having just toured the other two rooms in the back. They were basically storage bins. In all, the downstairs rooms totaled 5, if she counted the kitchen and dining rooms as 2 separate rooms. As she walked back into the living room, seeing her bags in the floor where she had left them, her heart went to her throat. The front door was still standing wide open. Just for a moment, however, for then she realized that she herself had left it open. No one would come racing through the darkened house behind her, where she had just switched off the light. No one would grab her from behind and throw her to the ground. Kayana went over to the door and closed it quickly, looking frantically along the edge of the frame for a lock of some sort. There was no shame as she locked the outside world out. This was her house now, for whoever owned it had left it open for her to inhabit. That thought bothered her, for she realized as she locked the world outside, she was locking herself inside. She shoved the deadbolt in place and sealed herself within the house. She meandered back over by the fire and sighed deeply. For a moment she decided to plop down on the couch and close her eyes. She sat soaking up the warmth like one of David Attenborough's beach-bathing reptiles. Her guts growled within her, and she realized she was hungry. In the back room she had passed a refrigerator in the kitchen, and a deep freezer. One of those horizontal things that Echo said looked like coffins. Kayana shuddered, and hoped there would only be animal meat in such a freezer. The knife in her hand was trembling. She stared at it absently as she tried to think about food in the face of all this fear. She had not thought to check upstairs. She'd forgotten all about it. Her concentration had been for the front door, and why no one was knocking it down to get back in. Thinking now, she couldn't remember if she had seen a back door to this place or not. She mentally tried to think her way through the rooms she had been through, without having to get up and go look again, in the darkness back there. In here it was nice and bright. Back in there it was dark and cold. Nothing made any sense to her now, she decided. She heard a sound and registered exactly what it was before she became afraid of what it meant. It happened so fast that the information was stored in her memory before she could be frightened of it. That was how wired and hopped up she was right now, sitting on this couch with the knife. Her senses were sharper than they had ever been before. It made her head hurt to be so painfully alert. She was just discovering that she might be getting a migraine headache when the noise had sounded in her ears. It was from upstairs. Her head had jerked towards the stairs, staring at the ceiling like she could see through the walls above, like she could know what the noise had been. She couldn't, and she stood up. She realized that she had to pee, but that would have to wait. The noise had her full attention, and until it was resolved, Kayana would not draw a sane wind of breath. She knew what the sound had been, but she did not believe it. It would be too simple an explanation for what it was. It couldn't have been what it sounded like. No way. Kaina had thought she had heard a woman's butt strike the floor upstairs. Now the butt would have only been a few inches off the floor when it was dropped to make that exact sound. She didn't know what it was, but damn it, she didn't have to hear it 1,000,000 times to know. It sounded like the sound Kaina would make when, after sitting on the floor for a while, she would try and get up and then fall back on her ass. The sound is a very distinct whump of full, unbalanced weight. There is no pain involved in such a fall, only an inward, awkward embarrassment. Nothing more than that. Kaina listened for the sound that might immediately follow. The sound that did immediately follow her own awkward attempts when she would try rising from the floor after such a fall. The snapping of ankles. Instead, she heard a howl of wind like all the demons from hell coming up out of the ground. She gasped and made a noise that was lost in the viciousness of the wind outside. The frame of the place shook, and the windows hummed through their screens like trapped whining spirits. Kaina felt herself tremble and shake uncontrollably. She realized that she was still wearing her ski mask, still pulled down tightly over her face. She ripped it off now to hear better. The hair on her head tangled up as she freed herself from the static, clean grip of the hat. She threw the hat onto the couch and cocked her head, pulling her hair away from her ears so she could hear. The noise of the wind rose to accommodate her efforts. The storm hit with a sudden fury that was frightening. It was almost like a tornado would feel. The pressure against the house was incredible. The great frame heaved its resistance, and there was more sound from upstairs now. Not the calm bump of a naked tail. No, now Kaina heard the scurry of feet across the wooden floor. She not only heard ankles popping and snapping now, but knees and elbows and other joints as well. Kaina listened as the bed springs bounced, for she thought there would be bed springs next. More of her déjà vu, maybe, but still, there they were, the squeak and reek of bed springs. Kaina knew there was a woman upstairs. The noise outside grew worse. The wind whined and whipped the house, and all the wire screens begged for mercy in their demonic whining. Kaina was afraid. She could not deny it, but now the thoughts of the girl upstairs diverted her. A feeling that Kaina would later recognize as her own first maternal stirrings were brewing deep within her virgin body. She saw the girl upstairs as being about the age of 5 years. Even the whump of the tail had been a lot heavier, though. For now the girl in her mind was 5 years old, and thinking this made Kaina brave for her sake. Obviously the family had left here and had been detained by the storm. The girl must be frightened, and Kaina should go up and see if she might comfort her, if she could, at least until her parents came home again and broke down the front door and demanded of Kaina just who in the hell she was. Kaina could see it now. The little girl would look up at her worried mom standing next to the stranger, Kaina Erbicum, and the little girl would say something like, "It's all right, Mama. She's my friend. I like her. She sat with me when the storm came." "Which is more than you did, Mama." Kaina would stare at the mother, a devious look creeping onto her face. The storm was here, and it was pissed. The ice slammed against the side of the house like chunks of green bottled glass from 1,000,000 broken Coke bottles. It seemed to be thrown against the house, and the glass of the windows came close to snapping. Kaina quivered, even though the room was hot enough to make her internally combust. The cold in her soul was not from the snow outside, but the fear in her bones, fear that made her arthritic and roomy in her joints. She stood up and felt the house shift beneath her. It didn't really move, but she thought it might. Those winds weren't playing games, and if she had been caught outside in this storm, she would be in deep shit about now. she would have probably suffocated in the blowing winds and ice-pelting snow. She could see herself trying to breathe in such a storm, her face bloodied from all the slicing shards of ice. She could feel the nitrogen that would be in the air as it sealed off her wind as easily as if she had been an octogenarian with heart disease out shoveling her driveway. Nothing and no one would make her leave this house tonight. She picked up her knife and started upstairs. She would explain the knife to the child as best as she could, but she would have it with her when they met. She might not be a 5-year-old child. The knife was her insurance, her leverage. How could she protect the little kid upstairs if she wasn't armed? How could she protect herself if the child wasn't a 5-year-old child at all? The stairs under her feet creaked despite her best efforts to remain light on her feet. She had read in a spy novel once where old houses had weak places in the center of their stairs. To stop the squeaking and possibly even falling between the rotted steps, a person should walk on the outside edges. This works wonderfully in theory, but not in practice. The damn steps still squeaked. She began her ascent up the long, narrow flight of stairs. She had the knife in front of her, and as she climbed, she listened for any more sounds coming from inside the room. She heard nothing now but the incessant howling of the wind outside. The little girl was probably in her bed, with the covers over her little head. Hopefully. Kaina was at the top of the stairs before she realized it. She placed her hand on the cold knob and turned it to the right, feeling the old noisy latch in the heavy wood clack open. The hinges squealed in protest. The weight of the old door was remarkably balanced on its hinges, she thought, as she stepped into a well-lighted room. There was yet another Fisher stove up here, and it was as hot as the one downstairs. The wind blowing through the flue fanned the flames within the metal box to a frenzy. They literally buzzed around the hot, glowing wood as she watched the fire burn through the open, daisy-wheeled draft knobs. She did not explore the rest of the upstairs first, as she should have done. She didn't check around for anyone lying in wait for her, and she didn't try to look out the back balcony door either. She turned to her immediate left towards the room from which downstairs she had heard the noises. Kaina's curiosity had gotten the better of her now, and she meant to know who was up here. As she was noticing the closed door of this room, she felt her eyes grow wide. She stared at the thing above the handle of the door. It was a padlock. Strange, thought Kaina. Suddenly she was afraid to want to go inside that room. She could have gone inside quite easily. The lock was hasped through its silver bar, so the person inside the room could not get out. But the hasp was not locked in the lock itself. It dangled freely so as to allow anyone outside to go in, whenever he pleased. Whenever he pleased, she could not fail to note. The lock in this shape immediately suggested to her several things, and she liked the sound of none of them. It suggested that there weren't many people involved with keeping this girl inside the room. It suggested that there might even be just one person involved. She felt herself nodding now, and she also realized that if someone was kept in this room, it must certainly be for a reason. Maybe the little girl was crazy. Kaina did shiver now, and audibly. Her teeth chattered together like a wind-up monkey's teeth would do as he bangs on his little brass cymbals. She was too scared to open the door now, but she knew that she would not be able to rest until she had seen what was in that room. If the little girl was crazy, could Kaina fend her off without hurting her? All Kaina had was her knife, and that would kill her. Kaina didn't wish to be known as the woman who breaks into people's houses and kills off idiot daughters, but that's how the headlines would read. Kaina realized why she was chattering her teeth so badly. Her tennis shoes were sopping wet, and now they were squishing beneath her weight. Her socks were wringing ass wet, and Kelly would have said this would make her sick. Kayana was going to sneeze in about 2 seconds. The sneeze was a reaction to her fears and the coldness of her feet, but it would also give away her location. The girl in the room would know Kayana was standing out here. Kayana realized that her little walk through the snow had soaked her totally to the bone, and if she didn't catch pneumonia, she would be lucky. Kayana did sneeze, loudly, 3 times. Choo! Achoo! Achoo! She wiped her hand across her mouth, feeling the pre-rawness that meant she was getting a cold. She blinked and sniffed and breathed through her mouth. The wet clothing would have to go, and soon. The figure behind the door came running over to where Kayana stood. Kayana could see the shadows of her feet as she stood behind the door now, waiting for Kayana to make some other noise by which the woman or girl or man or whoever was back there might judge her identity. Kayana froze, her breathing open mouth, tickling the back of her throat. The figure was listening for her. Kayana leaned close to the crack of the door, where the padlock dangled in its hasp, like a weighted ear-ring. As Kayana strained to hear any noise at all from the figure behind the door, she was startled to hear a voice, as plain as day, in her right ear. "Hey," said the voice. It came from behind the door, but through the crack in the great door, closed shut as it was, it sounded like a voice in Kayana's head, rather than coming from behind the door. It was like listening to a pair of headphones for the first time. The music seems to be coming from the middle of your head. "Hey yourself," said Kayana, before she could stop herself. The silence told Kayana that her voice had confused the inhabitant of the room. Of course it would, since Kayana had never spoken here before. Kayana waited until she had something better to say before she spoke again. It was as if each of them did not want the other to know more than she had to divulge. Kayana's face, tight from the stress and cold, had to smile at this game. Only 2 girls like themselves would stand on so silly a ceremony as this. Given their situation, it was downright stupid of them. "Is it open?" asked the voice again, and Kayana knew now that she was a girl who was locked in this room. Kayana looked at the door and knew that the captive inside wanted to know whether or not the hasp was latched. The girl inside had obviously understood that sometimes the captor, whoever he was, left the lock undone, probably out of convenience for himself. "Yes," said Kayana, revealing more valuable knowledge to the woman behind the door. "Open," the girl said haltingly. "It. Open it." "Nuh-uh," said Kayana, wincing at her choice of words. "First, what are you doing in there?" Kayana really wanted to know whether or not she was being held because of her mental state, or just out of some sort of punishment. Kayana had asked her as if she could be assured that the answer she would get was true, of course. Of course, it would be highly unlikely, Kayana, that she would give you the proper information if she really is crazy or dangerous. All captives want out, even the nuttiest of them. The captive, by way of reply, skittered back across the floor, leaving Kayana to watch as her feet withdrew into shadows unknown. Now if Kayana wanted to, it was her best opportunity to have a look-see. She could have the lock replaced and latched well before the captive could get back over here again. Temptation was biting at her, but she endured its bites and stayed calm. Now was not the time to do anything stupid, like let the cat out of the bag. She might turn into a real tiger. "Come back here," ordered Kayana, miffed at this setback in her interrogation of this woman. Kayana wasn't prepared for her to obey her order, but the captive did it. She clattered back over to the door again, and seemed to be awaiting a further order, should Kayana have one for her. Kayana felt a bit of pride in this. It was the first order she had ever given in her life. Kayana tried to think of something else to command her genie in the room to perform for her. "Who are you?" asked Kayana aloud, "and why are you in there?" "Him," said the small voice, made smaller by the heavy gravity of that awful word. Him. There would have to be a him in here somewhere, she knew. Of course. One man, one lock, one captive. Sure. "Where is he?" asked Kayana, as she heard the doorknob turn from the other side. The girl wanted to come out, or at least open the door. After she did this, however, she turned away from the door and moved slowly away again. Kayana watched as her feet retreated away into the shadows again, and stood wondering to herself. Kayana knew that she couldn't order her to do anything else until she opened the door and made her obey her in person. Kayana shook her head. "Well, after all," she said, "I am the drenched, murderously armed hitchhiker from hell. If I don't go inside, she can't come out here. If she attacks me, I'll skewer her with this sword." Kayana reached up, her hand trembling, and she touched the lock. There was a faint pink color around its base that Kayana had not noticed before. This pink color went up into the lock, and Kayana realized that was why the lock wasn't closed. Its lock was full of bubble gum. Failing to see the significance in this, she lifted the lock off the hasp as carefully as she could. Ideally, she wanted to do it without a sound, so as to have the advantage over the captive in the room. This was not only impossible to do, it made worse her situation. She clacked the hasp against the door at least twice more than was necessary to get it out of its holder. Kayana was out of patience by this time. She had to meet this person, for their very lives did depend upon the combined information they could share with each other. Kayana needed to know who and why the captive was being held in this room. The captive needed to know how Kayana had come to be here. Together they might have a chance. Separate, both of them would suffer. Kayana would suffer because she couldn't prepare herself for this him, this captive person. And the captive would suffer because the captor would accuse her of having known of Kayana's presence all along. Separate, and they both were endangered. Kayana opened the door as firmly as she could. She knew there was no other way. A smell of light sourness came out of the room, and Kayana recognized that smell with some chagrin. It was the smell of woman mixed with very little air. A close-up, unhygienic smell. Kayana wrinkled her nose up and walked inside the room. The smell wasn't really that bad, just old and not aired out. Inside the room there was a fireplace against the wall. There was a fire in the fireplace, and in front of the fire stood the captive. She had her back to Kayana, as if she no longer cared one way or the other whether Kayana opened the door or not. This perplexed Kayana, who would have bet the girl would have been overly joyed to see her. This was not the case. The girl stood there, dressed in an old Indian blanket. She wasn't wearing any shoes, and Kayana thought that was weird. The girl had long, stringy, brownish hair. The cut of her hair had long since grown out, and through the tangled mass of brown, Kayana could make out what had once been a very pretty shag cut. Now all of the ends were the same length, and all of them tangled around her shoulders like seaweed on a low-tide boulder. The girl didn't look back at Kayana. Despite Kayana's best efforts at diminishing her fears, she could not help but think of the psycho scene where the woman turned the body of Mother around to find the leering skull in the swinging of the dim-wadded light bulb. Kayana made herself behave by swallowing hard and pressing on. This wasn't going to happen here. It couldn't. That was television, and it could not happen here. Could it? The figure had not moved since Kayana had opened the door and come into the room. Was it just possible that Kaina's mind had played tricks on her, and the woman had never spoken to her at all? Was it just possible that this woman was stuffed and mounted here by this fire? That was how the woman was standing, not moving a muscle. Kaina stopped and waited for any sign of movement before she continued. The figure still did not move. "Are you all right?" asked Kaina, uncertain. The figure didn't acknowledge Kaina's voice at all, and Kaina was really getting spooked now. She had thought she had seen feet moving when she had been behind the door outside, and she had thought she had heard a voice, hadn't she? Had that just been in her head? Had she hallucinated this woman outside just now? Was it the ghost of this woman she had heard? Kaina saw the girl breathe, and she nearly collapsed with relief. At least she's still alive. The girl turned toward Kaina, and Kaina's eyes really did grow wide this time. Kaina made a noise in her throat that was somewhere between a light moan and a grunt of exertion. So much made sense to Kaina now that her surprise was shocking. If someone had told her she would see what she was seeing now, Kaina would have called that someone a liar. This just was not possible. Kaina tried to speak and couldn't. The shock was too great. Her voice, with all that newly formed phlegm blocking her throat, was gone away. All she was able to do was stand here in front of this young girl and make stupid noises in her closed throat. What Kaina saw was obscene. It was not natural. It was like taking a life and then draining all of the joy and all of the life out of it, and replacing only that rhythmic sucking of breathing air in and out of the lungs. If the woman before her had been a skeletal frame of hair and parchment flesh, it could not have surprised Kaina any more than it did. The woman before Kaina was stark naked, except for her blanket. There was no real light in those pretty brown eyes, none that Kaina could see. The girl looked listless and dead tired. Kaina wanted to reach out and touch her, but she couldn't. Her arms would not yet move. The girl could have attacked Kaina quite easily now, if she had wanted to. In a second that revelation to Kaina was quelled by the very sight of this poor kid. No way would she attack anyone for a very long time. As Kaina tried to accept what she was seeing, it flashed across her mind now, for the first time, in sentence form. There, standing in front of her, was Brandy Ann Manson. Chapter 10. Kelly Erbicum Blue was no longer herself. Her daughter had never come home to the house, and she had not called her either. Kaina had just vanished off the face of the earth. Kelly was snowbound with the greatest example of unevolved male since Major Dad. She couldn't stand it. She couldn't bear to go on sucking in oxygen without knowing where Kaina was. The storm had hit them hard. It had to be at least 6 feet deep outside now. Kelly sat in Don's favorite chair, oblivious to his desire to sit there himself, and she stared out of a window. It had been a full week since Kaina should have been there with him, and still not a word. With each passing day, Kelly grew more and more bitchy and less human. It wasn't all her fault, however. She had a lot of pills that assisted her in this deterioration of character. She was popping old tranquilizers by the handsful. The blizzard, with those damned howling winds and clattering glass pellets of ice, made her as crazy as the loss of her daughter. Sitting in this chair by the window every day, staring out at the erased countryside of white and overcast No. 2 leaded sketchwork, Kelly recalled how Kaina had begged her to come home, and how Kelly had threatened to whip her when she got back to Ohio. What sort of a monster would whip an obedient daughter for wanting to be with her mother? She wished God would strike her dead where she sat by this lonely old window, streaked with yellowish age and her own blinding tears. She was seriously contemplating suicide. Dawn appeared in the doorway, looking hysterical. She snorted snot out of her nose through her steady trail of tears. This damned fool was a scream. He had on his most rural clothes, and God only knew where he had purchased them. She had never seen such things advertised in any store. These clothes weren't from a catalog of any kind that she had ever seen. These clothes had to have been handed down from generation to generation since Adam. These clothes had to have been made over the years, for no manufacturer would claim them. They were unique in all the world. Don looked like a convict extra from the days of Cool Hand Luke. Why did he have to pick her most trying, difficult times to fret her with his inane, heathen ways? He looked like Daryl's other brother, Daryl, from the Newhart show. He was wearing a stretch-band ear cap with the chin straps dangling hopelessly lost in that outmoded aviator-esque style. He had on flannel, of course. Kaina would have raged over that alone. This wasn't L.L. Bean bright and colorful flannel. No, it was faded and dull, as if it had been made from the skirts of his great-granddaddy's kilt after he got off the friggin' boat on the way over here. And his four-buckle Arctic boots were loosely jangling, pushed out of line by his pants cuffs wadded down into them for that special Dennis the Menace effect. He looked like shit, in other words. She shook her head, though, for she had to admit that out here no one was likely to see him, or to care to see him, and that included her. This was limbo out here, and she was just his wife. He didn't have to impress her any more. Kelly was beginning to wonder if isolation constituted mental cruelty in the divorce courts. He turned away, wordlessly rejected, as if his sense of fashion was a direct reflection on his very being. Accept me, accept my flannel. That sort of shit. Oh, what a Neanderthal he was. His total worth was all shoved up inside his thing, and that she could make impotent with just a word. She should have stuck with her own private little soldier and stayed in Ohio with her daughter. What a girlish and stupid thing it had been for her to leave her vibrator in Ohio. What a stupid and idealistic thing for her to do. Don had not been exactly regular since they had tied the marriage knot. It was as if she had tied it around his dick, for he was down more than he was up since they had married. But to forget her lifelong friend, whom she had replaced 5 times since Kaina was born, that was unforgivable. It did no good to leave the vibrator in Ohio, for Kaina wouldn't have dreamed of using it on herself. Ever. She had seen it once, by accident, and she had embarrassed the hell out of Kelly by rolling her eyes at it. Now she neither had her vibrator nor Kaina for any comfort. Where in the name of hell was Kaina? 5 days, was it? 4? She didn't know. More than 3, she was sure. A call to the police had resulted in less than nothing. Only the police could provide her with less than she had before she had called them. They were all on this same macho dick-on-my-hip-in-the-holster kick. Screw them. Well, now, ma'am, you know how young girls are. She might have got herself a wild hair, and she could be anywhere by this time. It's been longer'n 48 hours, so we'll take a report. It ain't going to make her show up no sooner. I gotta tell you that right off. Really, I didn't know that. I was just under the impression you jerks could do miracles. Kelly was feeling the need for another tranquilizer. She exhaled forcefully and wiped her snotty nose with the back of her hand. Her tears streaked her face, and her jaws were puffy. She needed release, and if she couldn't get worked up for sex, or forced to do it with Don, then she would do these little capsules. And why not? She looked down at her hand and saw that she had one ready to drop. "Tiny little powerful balls, these things," she mused to herself. "More balls than Don has. Don should have thrown these out of the house before Kelly had come here to live. Kelly was the ultimate prescription junkie. Alka-Seltzers even. Those she loved with ice, for that added effect of the stinging rush. Extra-strength Alka-Seltzer was her usual bane. She stared at the little capsule in the palm of her hand, and she dry-swallowed it, choking it down. By the time it reached her stomach, it was the size of a small football. Only then would she sip water to pack it down. She was getting dangerously angry with herself over Kaina, and self-inflicted misery was just the beginning of what she could do to herself if Kaina did not come home soon. It was that damned Scarlet Ibis story again. Periodically, throughout Kelly's life, she would regret reading that story. She hated that story. Though reading the Scarlet Ibis had been required in her 10th grade English class, had Kelly to do it over again, she would have never done that story. She would have taken the 0 for the course. The Scarlet Ibis was a story about two brothers, one younger and one older. The older of the two boys tells all of his friends to run from the younger boy, to outdistance him so they don't have to play with him. The great and terrible thing the author did here was to make the younger boy sweet and innocent and not like the older boys at all. This boy only wanted to be included in their play, and of course since he wanted that, it was to be denied him. The younger boy is also afflicted with a condition that makes him physically sick. He has something like a wasting disease, which will not allow him to live a long life anyway. That is when a Scarlet Ibis lands near them in the earlier part of the story. The mother has explained that the Scarlet Ibis is so beautiful because it is rare and so very fragile. The younger brother muses to himself that he is a lot like this bird with its fragile life. He enjoys looking at the white bird with its red plumage around the face, the scarlet plumage, from where the bird gets its name. The boys eventually do decide to run away from the younger brother and to play by themselves without his sensitive presence. The younger brother gives one of the most heart-rending chases ever written, trying to catch his older brother and his friends. He does his damnedest to catch up with them, but they run easily, far away from him. But the young boy does not give up so easily. They had not counted on the strength of his will. They did not know that he was, inside, stronger than any of them, even stronger than his physical body could handle. He has a desire that is beyond life, a drive deep within his fragile, wasted body. Soon the boys realize that he is no longer behind him, and they figure that he will eventually catch up with him. But as they stop to catch their wind, the older brother is fearful that something is wrong. They wait, and the boy does not catch them. They run back along the road to see if they've lost him yet. They have. He is lying in the road, blood coming out of his nose and ears. He looks just like the young boy's favorite bird that they found in the road a week before. A gorgeous Scarlet Ibis lying in the road, just as dead, just as pale, and just as bloodied. How could any older brother ever draw a sane breath again after doing that? She wondered about her 10th grade teacher, who had droned on and on about the meaning of the story, and how she wanted the class to come up with the usual crap, like irony, foreshadowing, imagery, and symbols. She had sat in her own silence for the longest time, near to tears, recalling this awful story over and over again that the teacher had just read to them. And now she was living it. "I am not any different," she sniffed, as the dope began to ooze into her central nervous system. "I am not any different at all. I ran away from my beloved little Ibis, the same as that wicked older brother had done. I am just as guilty for whatever happens to Kaina, and I will bleed just as much. For I will bleed Her mind was cut off in mid-sob, and she dreamed the rest. I will bleed out of my wounded soul. Echo was watching television in the Airbecum apartment. She was feeling so good lately that she hadn't thought a lot about Kaina, or why Kaina had not called her or written her. Echo had been busy maturing, and since her sex talk with Mrs. Cherbourg, Echo had not touched the ground. It was all right to feel good. She would catch herself now, lying luxuriously back on the chair, purring contentedly to herself. Her self-esteem and her confidence had been bolstered. Her whole mental outlook had been changed, and feeling good about thinking of Kaina was just part of it. She was still fantasizing sexually about Kaina, but now when she would recall it, it would be with that sentimental value Mrs. Cherbourg had spoken of. She really was erotically turned on by thoughts of Kaina coming home. Strange, this power of sexually induced feeling. She had started having nocturnal emissions now, and those wild dreams would have pleased old Andy Warhol, or that other weirdo they'd studied in a history lesson, the one that had just died, that painter with the melting clocks. She couldn't recall his name. Her wet dreams were weirder than her love for Kaina. These dreams depicted her as a willing partner with the locker door downstairs in gym class, rubbing against it until it felt good. The book that Mrs. Cherbourg had given her said what Mrs. Cherbourg herself had said, that all of her dreams, fantasies, emissions, pleasurings, and touchings, however bizarre in content, were perfectly normal. There was something very heavenly pleasing about the words perfectly normal. She was well within the definition of bizarre, she knew, with her own thoughts, but they were all perfectly normal. It felt wonderful to know she was perfectly normal. Why couldn't her mother love her enough to tell her these things, and draw them close together, like Kelly and Kaina were close? Why couldn't her mother do that? She was now feeling sadness at the loss of her mother's attention, for Echo had lost Brenda Bradley. Brenda was a zombie for the Roman Catholic Church, and God help her repression, her condemnation of other people, and her fierce, intense, hating guilt. God help her poor, pitifully repressed mother. At least, that's what Mrs. Cherbourg had said to pray for. God, prayed Echo, please help my mother, who doesn't know any better. What hurt Echo the most was not being able to have these conversations with her own flesh and blood mother. Several times, Echo would start to bring up a conversation like this, on this particular subject, and Brenda would change it immediately. Echo was now having one other little fantasy she was wishing was true. Echo's fantasy was to be Mrs. Cherbourg's daughter. She had even confided this to Mrs. Cherbourg during their last meeting. Mrs. Cherbourg had laughed and stroked her hair lightly, saying nothing. There was nothing to say. Echo was getting back at her mother now. She had a secret, one besides the fact that she was no longer a virgin, a better, newer secret. The Airbecum apartment. Echo smiled deceitfully to herself. Not even old Den Mother had a clue she was up here. No one knew that Echo came up here to escape Mother, the Catholic Church, and every damn body else for a few blessed hours, a few blessed cigarettes, and a couple of beers. She was even free to touch herself in here, to self-pleasure, without anyone disturbing her. This was her own little bit of heaven, all to herself. She was tempted to go prowling through Kelly's drawers, just to see what things that were left for her to discover, what things she needed to know before she was a complete woman. She especially wanted to go prowling through Kelly's drawers, because Kelly had had a man, and would have a lot of those feminine maintenance things lying about. Kelly hadn't taken all of her things with her. In fact, their bathroom closet bore testimony to this fact. Echo had so far seen a complete hygienic line of goods in there, presumably left for Kaina. Kaina had failed to take anything with her except her own stuff. That meant that there might still be a lot of neat things in Kelly's drawers, way back in the back. but she was not yet brave enough to do it. Later, maybe, she would violate the sanctity of their privacy, but not now. Later, when she ran out of cigarettes, beer, and patience, then she would go treasure hunting. Not now. The phone rang. For an instant, Echo started to answer it. Then she thought better of it. A fear passed through her as she listened to that hateful ringing. She was sure old Den Mother was outside the door, waiting to see if anyone picked up the phone to answer it. It would just be Echo's luck, in fact, for Den Mother to have seen her enter the place and not leave again. Someone would have to be in here, and if no one answered that damnably loud ringing, then at least one person was allowing it to continue to ring, and that person was Echo Joy Bradley. She was damned if she did answer it, and she was damned if she didn't. But who was calling this number now? Echo had to make a decision, and fast. The phone had 3 rings so far. Yet Echo wasn't supposed to be here. The only person who knew that Echo might be in here was Kaina. Of course, silly goose, it's Kaina. On the 5th ring, Echo jerked the phone up and said hello. Kelly, who had spent the night zoned out of her mind on tranquilizers, had decided to act this morning. She woke up, the dry, cottony taste of her tranquilizer still making her high, and still making her guzzle water to chase it away. She had decided to call home. It was a long shot, but the police were useless. They swore they had men looking for her everywhere, as best as they could. The roads were all blocked with great depths of driven snow, from Ashwood to Madras, down 97, and even including that nameless bit of road Kaina had gotten herself trapped on, all the roads had been impassable for a week. Only now was the sun starting to come out for a few hours a day and melt some of this great precipitation away. That had led to still more problems. All that melted water was not evaporating. The sky was already saturated, and at night that water would turn to ice, thus solidifying the old snow even harder. This served to keep the snow from sublimating back into the sky as vapor. In other words, this icy slush would be here for a while. The phone was ringing back in Canton now, as Kelly hoped against hope. It was stupid. No one was there. If Kaina had made it back home again, she'd have called. No, Kaina was not at home, but to call their number somehow made her feel better. Kaina, God, girl, where are you? Hello? On the 5th ring, Kelly felt her heart drop. Hello, repeated the voice, less certain this time. Kay? Asked Kelly nervously, as if she had somehow found a way to speak to the dead. Who? Asked Echo before she realized who it was calling her. Who is this? Demanded Kelly angrily. This is Echo, Mrs. Erbickham, said Echo. She winced. Kelly was no longer Mrs. Erbickham. She couldn't be. She was Mrs. Blue. Echo, asked Kelly, what are you doing there? Echo had no answer for her. Where's my daughter, Echo? Where's Kaina? Said Echo, searching the room with her eyes and seeing nothing but the empty insides of her answers. She's with you, isn't she? No, Echo. She never made it past Portland. I was hoping she had come home. No, ma'am, she hasn't. Silence. Uncomfortable silence. Echo felt her guts twist, only this time it wasn't pleasurable. Her mouth was so dry her nose was burning. How did you get into our place, Echo? Asked Kelly. Kaina, began Echo, her thoughts jumbling in her head. She let me, she let me have a key. You see, you had a spare taped inside the drawer? Kelly said nothing. She said I could come in and what, Echo? Asked Kelly. And smoke cigarettes and drink your beer and let my hair down. Damn, woman, what do you want? What do you think? Thought Echo. Well, never mind that now, said Kelly, realizing she didn't want to alienate Echo. Echo was her only hope of getting information back in Ohio. When was the last time you saw her? 3 days ago. No, wait, said Echo, trying to count them. Her eyes got big when she realized it had been 5 days now. 2 days ago, Echo was over at Mrs. Cherborg's place, getting her sex talk. 3 days before that, Kaina had left her at the airport. I went to the airport with Kaina, Mrs. Blue, said Echo, 5 days ago. Oh, Kelly, please don't tell my mama. God, no, she'll whip me to death. My mama doesn't know I'm up here." There were tears in Echo's voice, real tears that made Kelly feel sorry for her. Her mother Brenda was unbearable at times. Even Mrs. T agreed with that. Kelly really believed that Brenda would kill Echo if she caught her up there alone. "Can you be trusted, Echo?" asked Kelly. "Yes, ma'am, I swear to God—" "Listen to me, Echo." "Yes, ma'am." "If you stay up there at our place, it's just you. No one else. Is that quite clear, young lady? No one but you." "Oh, yes, ma'am, there's no one. Swear to me." "I swear." "I mean it, Echo. No one but you. I will not admit to knowing you're up there. You better be good, 'cause it's on you if you don't. I have to say this, Echo. If they ask me, I'll deny I gave you permission to be up there. This is on you, darling." "Yes, ma'am." "Take this number down, Echo. You got a pen?" "Yes, right here." Kelly gave her a number to call if Kaina showed up. It was the number to the Blue residence in Ashwood, Oregon. "Now you call me if you hear anything." "Yes, ma'am." "Goodbye, Echo. Be good." "I will," said Echo. "And thank you, Mrs. Blue." "You're welcome, Echo. I will trust you so long as you earn my trust. And call me the first moment you hear anything from Kaina. Goodbye." "Bye-bye," said Echo, hanging up the phone slowly. When she had done this, her head ached furiously. That was too damn close. She shivered in terror of Brenda finding out. If her mother knew she played with herself, it would be hell to pay. But this would get her the rack. Lying was one thing that made her mother forget how to punish properly at all. Lying made her mother go absolutely ballistic. She threw things at her when she got mad. Things like the ceramic ashtray, her car keys, and other heavily pointed objects. What was it with these damned Catholics and lying? She could not figure that out at all. Echo still had a mark on her back where Brenda had pegged her at a distance of 20 yards with a garden trowel. Echo had been all of 7 years old at the time. Right now she wanted to vomit. She was so sick with fear. The other thing was just as bad. Kaina was missing. Forgetting her beer and cigarette breath, Echo ran out the door, locking it hurriedly behind her. She was running as fast as she could down to see Mrs. Cherbourg. There was nothing that Mrs. Cherbourg could do except comfort her, but that was now exactly what Echo needed more than anything else in the world. A little love. Kelly hung up the phone now. She had stood holding it to her ear long after Echo had hung up. A strangeness had come over her, and she didn't want to give up her only link with civilization that easily. Being snowbound sucked, it really did. Don was out in the garage, thank God. Maybe he would just stay out there, tending his fire and doing whatever it was that he enjoyed so much out there. Thank God the phone lines had come back. Echo was a guest in their home, and no one was there but her. She wondered how she really felt about that. Kelly shook her head. Kaina would let Echo do that, wouldn't she? Kaina wasn't yet adult enough to realize that children can't be given these luxuries. It isn't safe to do that. Kids, they can screw up so much so easily, and then it's all just too bad. Kelly had lied to Echo about denying that she would know she was up there. She would admit to it, but using child psychology on Echo was a way of assuring some obedience from her. By thinking that Kelly would lie to avoid being prosecuted, Echo would have to be careful. It would this way all be upon Echo and Kaina for what they had done. She's probably found your vibrator by this time, thought Kelly to herself, and she's blasting herself through the ceiling with it every few hours. That was why she was there when you called. With a toy like that, she'll be there all the time. Kelly felt her head begin to split. She hadn't taken any tranks lately, and she needed one badly. Her body was saying it was time for one, or else a whole lot of pain would commence pounding away on her. She took the pill and closed her eyes, waiting for it to punch deeply into her worries for her missing princess, Kaina Shea. Tears leaked down her face in tight streams.